Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story where silence lingers a little longer than it should, where corridors stretch beyond their purpose, and where one room, quietly, patiently, never seems to be empty. There are places that seem to exist just outside of time, places that are neither fully present nor entirely gone, but instead linger in a quiet in-between, where moments do not quite pass in the way they should, where the air feels settled rather than still, and where even the smallest sound seems to arrive a fraction too late, as though it has traveled a longer distance than it should have. The hotel was one of those places. It stood at the edge of a road that seemed to forget itself the farther it stretched, where the passing of cars had grown infrequent over the years, and where even the wind moved with a kind of hesitation, as though uncertain whether it was welcome there at all, brushing lightly against the building before continuing on, leaving nothing behind but a faint suggestion that it had ever been there. Its windows reflected the sky, though not quite accurately, holding on to a stillness that did not belong to the drifting clouds above, and the sign that hung over the entrance remained unlit, its letters faintly visible, but no longer announcing anything to those who might pass by, as if it no longer expected to be noticed. Inside, the air carried a softness that felt settled rather than stale, as though it had been resting in place for a very long time, untouched by urgency, untouched by change, and perhaps even untouched by memory itself. It was the kind of place where sound did not travel in the usual way, where footsteps seemed to follow rather than lead, and where silence was not simply the absence of noise, but something that existed on its own, something that listened. Sophia noticed this the moment she stepped inside. She had not planned to stay long, not in any deliberate sense, but in the quiet, practical way of someone passing through, someone who only needed a place to rest before continuing forward again, without forming any attachment to where she had stopped. The road had stretched longer than expected, the light dimming slowly into an evening that seemed reluctant to end. And by the time the hotel appeared, it did so without warning, as though it had been waiting just beyond her awareness until the exact moment she needed it. One moment, there had been trees lining the roadside, their shapes blending together in the fading light, and the next, the building stood there, steady and unmoving, as if it had always belonged to that exact space and had simply revealed itself when she was ready to see it. The door opened easily beneath her hand, without resistance, without sound, as though it had already decided to let her in before she had even reached it. No bell announced her arrival. No distant voice called out in greeting. There was only the faint impression that something, somewhere deeper inside the building, had shifted slightly in response. The lobby stretched wider than she expected, not grand in any obvious way, but extended, as though its dimensions had been allowed to grow just a little beyond what was necessary, giving the room a quiet sense of distance, even when standing still. The ceiling felt higher than it should have been, and the corners of the space seemed to rest just outside comfortable focus, as if they were not entirely interested in being seen. At the far end stood a long wooden desk, its surface worn smooth in places where hands had rested countless times before, where the passage of people had left behind something subtle but lasting. Behind it sat a man. He did not look up immediately, and for a moment, Sophia had the distinct impression that he was listening, though there was nothing obvious to listen to, no sound that explained his stillness. Then, slowly, as though responding to something she could not hear, he raised his gaze. "Checking in?" he asked, his voice calm and even, carrying no sense of surprise, as though her arrival had been expected, or perhaps simply inevitable. Sophia nodded, the motion feeling slightly more noticeable in the stillness of the room. "Yes," she said quietly. "Just for the night." The man inclined his head in a way that felt practiced, though not mechanical, as though this exchange had occurred many times before in exactly the same way. Of course. Without turning to any book or register, he reached for a key. Room 27. The number was etched into a small metal tag, its surface dulled by time and touch, though still clearly readable. "Second floor," he said, placing it gently on the desk between them. End of the hall. Sophia hesitated, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, her attention lingering not on the key, but on the quiet space behind the man, where the hotel seemed to extend into something deeper. "Are there many guests?" she asked, her voice softer now, shaped by the stillness around her. The man paused just briefly, though the pause felt longer than it should have. "Some," he replied. And then, without further explanation, he slid the key toward her. The corridor upstairs seemed ordinary at first glance, stretching out in a straight line with identical doors placed at even intervals along both sides, each one closed, each one still, as though they had not been opened in a very long time. But as Sophia walked, she became aware of something subtle, something difficult to define, yet impossible to ignore once it had been noticed. The distance between the doors did not remain consistent, not in any visible, measurable way, but in the quiet sense that each step carried her slightly farther than expected, as though the hallway adjusted itself in small, imperceptible increments, gently resisting her movement forward. The lights overhead emitted a low, steady hum, a sound that blended into the air so completely that it became less of a noise and more of a presence, something that filled the space without drawing attention to itself. Room numbers passed slowly. 12, then 14, then 18. Some numbers seemed to be missing, though she could not be certain whether they had been skipped, or whether her attention had simply drifted for a moment too long, allowing them to pass unnoticed. By the time she reached room 27, there was a quiet sense of relief in stopping, as though she had been walking longer than she should have needed to. The key turned easily. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the room felt prepared, though not recently, as though it had been set in order at some earlier time, and then left untouched, waiting without urgency for someone to arrive. A bed stood neatly made, the fabric smooth and undisturbed, while a small table rested near the window, where the curtains allowed only a portion of the fading light to enter, casting a soft, unmoving glow across the floor. Everything appeared still, not abandoned, not forgotten, just paused. Sophia stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing slightly more than expected, as though the room acknowledged the sound in its own quiet way. For a while, nothing seemed unusual, or at least nothing that could not be explained by the unfamiliarity of the place, the long drive, or the quiet that settled more deeply here than it did anywhere else. She moved slowly, placing her bag down, brushing her fingers along the surface of the table, sitting on the edge of the bed as the mattress dipped gently beneath her weight. There were no sounds from outside, no distant traffic, no voices passing through the walls. Only that faint, ever-present hum that seemed to exist throughout the building, steady and unchanging, like something breathing very slowly. It was easy, after some time, to stop noticing it entirely. It was later, though time had begun to feel less defined, as though it no longer moved in clear, measurable increments, that she first heard something different, a sound from the corridor. Soft, measured, like footsteps, though not quite distinct enough to follow, as though they belonged to someone moving carefully, or perhaps someone who did not want to be heard at all. She sat up slowly, listening, her breath held without her realizing it. The sound continued for a few seconds, then faded, leaving the silence to settle once again into its familiar place, though it did not feel quite the same as before. She told herself it was another guest, someone moving through the hallway, returning to their room, closing a door without making a sound. And yet, she had not seen anyone. Not when she arrived. Not in the corridor. Not even a shadow passing beneath a door. The next sound came later, and this time it was closer. Not footsteps. Something softer. A faint shifting, like fabric brushing lightly against itself, or the quiet adjustment of someone repositioning their weight. The sound seemed to come from just beyond her door. Not distant, not imagined, but near. Very near. Sophia remained still, her attention drawn completely toward the door, as though any movement might cause the sound to disappear entirely. It lingered for a moment, then faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt slightly altered, as though something had briefly interrupted it and then slipped away again. And with it came a quiet, persistent thought. Someone was standing in the hallway, just outside, waiting. She did not move immediately, though her awareness sharpened, her senses adjusting to the stillness in a different way, listening not just for sound, but for absence, for the subtle difference between nothing and something that chose not to be heard. No knock followed. No voice. No further movement. Only the quiet. Eventually, she stood, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that matched the pace of everything around her, as though moving too fast might disturb something unseen. The room felt smaller now, not in size, but in presence, as though the walls had drawn slightly closer through the weight of silence. She crossed to the door and opened it gently. The corridor stretched out before her. Empty, still, unchanged. And yet, not entirely the same. The air felt cooler, thinner, as though something had recently moved through it and left it unsettled. Sophia stepped into the hallway, her footsteps softened by the carpet, her gaze drifting slowly toward the far end where the corridor seemed to bend slightly out of view. And that was when she noticed it. A door. Closed, like all the others, but different. There was light beneath it. Not the steady glow of the hallway lights, but something softer, more uncertain, as though it flickered gently, responding to movement within rather than illuminating the space on its own. Sophia frowned slightly, her memory searching for where that door had been before, trying to recall passing it, noticing it, understanding its place among the others. But she could not. And yet now it seemed impossible to ignore. She walked toward it slowly, each step measured, each movement deliberate, as though the corridor itself resisted her approach in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The distance felt longer again, stretched, uncertain. But eventually she reached the door. There was no number. The surface of the wood was smooth, uninterrupted, untouched by the small metal plates that marked every other room along the hall. There was no handle, only a keyhole, and the faint, shifting light beneath it. Sophia leaned closer, her breath quiet, her presence tentative, as though she were approaching something that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be found. The light flickered again, not like a lamp, more like movement, as though something inside the room shifted slowly, casting shadows that came and went without pattern. She listened, and there it was again. That same soft sound, fabric, movement, someone adjusting their position. Inside the room, Sophia stepped back, a quiet tension settling into her chest. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but present in a way that could not be ignored. There was someone inside. There had always been someone inside. She glanced back down the corridor, still empty, still silent, still watching in its own way. When she turned back, the light beneath the door dimmed slightly, as though something had moved closer to it, blocking its path, interrupting its quiet escape into the hallway. And in that moment, a thought settled into her mind with a strange, steady certainty. The room was occupied. It had never been empty. Sophia turned away, slowly, carefully, as though leaving too quickly might draw attention, might cause something behind the door to respond. She returned to room 27 without looking back. That night, she did not sleep fully, only drifting in and out of a light, fragile stillness, where time seemed to fold gently over itself, where moments repeated without quite repeating, and where the boundary between waking and dreaming felt thinner than it should have been. And through it all, she thought she could hear something. Not from the corridor, not entirely, but closer. A faint shifting, soft, measured, as though it no longer remained at the end of the hall. Morning came without announcement, the darkness fading slowly into a dim, uncertain light that did not fully replace it, but simply softened its edges. Sophia sat up, her movements quiet, her thoughts slower than usual, as though they too had been shaped by the stillness of the hotel. The room looked the same, unchanged, untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. And yet, something felt different. Not in the room, but in her awareness of it. She stepped into the corridor once more. This time it felt shorter, the doors closer together, the distance easier to cross, as though the hallway had decided for now to behave normally. When she reached the place where the unnumbered door had been, she stopped. It was gone. In its place stood another door, number 29, identical to all the others. Closed, silent, still. Sophia stared at it for a long moment, her thoughts quiet, her certainty unsettled. Then slowly, she reached for the handle. It turned easily. Inside, the room was empty. A bed, a table, curtains half drawn, everything in its place, everything still, and yet the air felt warmer. Not noticeably, not enough to prove anything, but enough to suggest that something had been there, recently. Sophia stepped back and closed the door. When she returned the key downstairs, the man at the desk accepted it without question, his expression unchanged, his presence as steady as before. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Sophia hesitated, her thoughts brushing lightly against the memory of the hallway, the door, the light. Then she nodded. Yes. The man inclined his head. Good. She paused. There was a room, she began quietly, at the end of the hall. But the man spoke before she could finish. All rooms are accounted for. His tone remained calm, certain, final. Sophia studied his face for a moment longer, searching for something that might shift, something that might acknowledge what she had seen. But there was nothing. Only stillness. Of course, she said softly. She stepped outside. The air felt lighter, less contained, as though it moved freely again. The road stretched out ahead of her, familiar in its quiet, leading her away without resistance. Behind her, the hotel remained, unmoving, unchanged. For a moment, she considered looking back, but she didn't. And as she walked farther from it, the stillness settled once more into its place, patient and undisturbed, as though nothing had ever interrupted it at all. Back inside the hotel, the corridors remained quiet. The doors stayed closed. The air did not move. And somewhere along the second floor, where the hallway stretched just a little farther than it should have, a faint light appeared beneath a door with no number, soft, unsteady. And just beyond it, something shifted, slowly, quietly, as though adjusting its position, as though it had never left, as though it was simply waiting for someone to notice it again. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the quietest moments can carry a story. If the stillness stayed with you, if the calm settled in gently, then let it remain a little while longer.